Pet swap. On balance.
So I can tell you where I'm coming from actually, and this might be ultimately kind of unhelpful to like a segmented approach, but the way that I conceptualize balance is heavily based off of the model that Richard Garfield proposes in his book Characteristics of Games.
Cool.
Specifically, that balance is a perceived characteristic, not an actual characteristic that people want. Like games that are totally mechanically balanced are another conversation, but it's often something that people don't fully appreciate, right?
Yeah.
And that perceived balance, the way that it is expressed is actually as a sort of a line graph, right? And it's effectively your likelihood of winning or losing on kind of the x-axis and time on the y-axis. So what that kind of comes out to, right, is that games which are maximally imbalanced, right, and I don't think this is controversial, are games where from the outset, so for the total duration of the game, it is obvious who is going to win, right, whether that's you or your opponent.
Yeah.
So from that, we can say that the longer a game is spent in an indeterminate state, the greater perceived balance it has. Whether the game is actually balanced is another question. And there are lots of games that understand that and leverage that model to, instead of producing states which are indeterminate because they have information, they're indeterminate because they don't have information. And that can lead to a different type of frustration that people actually have difficulty articulating. So like a great example of the way that some schools of thought leverage the idea of perceived balance is through end game scoring, right? If you only score a game at the end, it's actually quite difficult to assess who is winning until the game is over. So necessarily you've taken this thing where it's like, okay, if perceived balance is just how long can people tell who's going to win, you defer it to the very end. And so in effect, throughout the whole game, you have a high degree of perceived balance, which tends to be true. It's just that creates other knock-on effects, right? With respect to like players' feeling of agency, right? Which is kind of another layer to it. But that tends to be the model that I hew to the most. So when I'm looking at my own games or when I analyze other games, I say to myself, like, okay, what about this game makes it feel imbalanced in a particular way? Not like mathematically, whether it's balanced or not. Because a great example of like a game that is technically very balanced, but it's hard to understand the specifics is like chess, right?
Right.
How much of an advantage is going first mathematically? Most people who play chess probably don't have a strong grasp of that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the whole of my model, independent of any like segmentation.
Chess is an interesting one, right? Because I think pretty common knowledge, white is always going to have that advantage from going first, right? And that's first player in a lot of games is going to inherently have an advantage just based off the mechanics that a lot of games use. They lean, and they typically always lean towards that first player. The opening move is going to have the advantage and carry that advantage throughout the rest of the game. There's things you can do, I think, to mitigate that, and that's where balance gets really interesting, because then you're essentially imposing some false behaviors on that first player in order to let the second player start to pick up more of that gap.
I think that in particular is a kind of a folk belief people have, right? The idea that going first is better, and I think that's just because it's certainly true for chess, right? But I don't know how many people would have that as received wisdom without being told, and B, when you talk about going first, always being advantageous, there's basically an entire taxa of games where that isn't true, and that's games with hidden information, right? Because going first forces you to reveal information before your opponent. So there are sort of wrinkles to that, but I think what's crucial is perception, right? Because you can also tell people things about games that are more or less true, which I think speaks to a conversation we had earlier that I don't know if we want to reference. We were talking about, if you give someone advice, should it be optimal, right? But I think sort of wandering a little bit on that.
Well, I think there's this distinction between like the player experience, like the amount of joy you can get from a game and how balance plays into that, versus like just what's the probability that you're going to win the game given your game state. And I think like I really like kind of what you're referencing, which is perceived balance, which kind of more impacts the amount of joy that you'll experience while playing, which is, if you don't know if you're winning or losing, then you're kind of you're still having fun trying to make the best moves that you can given the situation.
Yeah, I mean the sort of value calculation is useful as a designer, certainly, but only insofar as like you want to make sure that the absolute best decisions are in line with like the theming of the game, right? So like you wouldn't want to make a game about like a skirmish game where very frequently retreating was the best option, right? I mean, there's maybe an argument for like some sort of theme you could build around that, but like in general, it's like the idea is that the pragmatic actions, the verbs of your theme should result in statistically, valuable moves. But the players don't necessarily need to know that. They should just be able to feel that through like the texture of the design, right?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, I feel like I'm driven personally towards these sort of like more mathematical problems of like, am I most effectively spending my points in this point buy system, or am like given the meta, am I making the most optimal decisions for my deck in a card game? And I think it's a different mindset than what you're referencing, but I really like what you're referring to, which is more about creating a play experience that has specific affects that you're trying to deliver at the table.
I think they tie together, right? Like I'm probably with you. Huge part of what I love and my gaming group loves is list building, right? So going in and calculating exactly what you're saying, right? Like what am I getting the most value for? What strategy am I building for? And you do a lot of that oftentimes before ever getting face to face with an opponent. Like you can spend hours pouring through books or online list builders, right? Chalking up that perfect force or list or what have you for a game. I think where balance comes into that is once you actually get to the table, right? You want to be able to put something down and your opponent is putting something down where as soon as you reveal what those lists are, the outcome isn't known, right? Both players are going to be satisfied trying to test essentially their skill or their competence in the game rather than arbitrary factors of some imbalance that's inherent in that rule set or those options available to the players in that rule set.
I even think inside of that mindset where you're like basically treating it like a game of economies, like I think there is a certain joy that I get when the game is imbalanced in that way too, like where you're like, it's not as satisfying to beat somebody who's it's not as satisfying to beat somebody who's like using the same exact like army as you are, as it is to like beating somebody who's like playing a meta list. There's like a certain joy, like a certain pleasure that I get when it's like, oh, I beat the best deck that was at this Magic tournament or something. And I think when you have like a perfectly balanced game that's like a coin flip, you lose out on those certain pleasures.
Well, I think what's happening there is that, so if you think of, so a game should have feedback, right? Going back to my example of games with end game scoring, that's flawed because you never get you get very little feedback. You can attempt to make the calculations, but it's difficult. And so naturally in games that provide feedback, your trajectory towards your understanding of the outcome evolves over time. So when you say, I really enjoy playing things that are that I perceive to be powerful, right? That I perceive to be meta, what you're effectively observing is that it's actually better for you as a player to start lower on that hierarchy so that you actually get more trajectory out of out of the play experience. Because otherwise, if we imagine that the delta of perceived chance of winning is static, right? If it has a static slope, going back to math, right? There's less of the game where you remain uncertain. Like, let's say for enjoyment purposes, players must remain below 70% certainty of victory in order to perceive the game state as balanced, right? Mm-hmm. So if you start lower on the hierarchy with the same slope, you can have more of the game where you're in that period of sort of like flow state uncertainty, where you're trending positive but still uncertain, which I think is positive overall. And you're right, that is a product of games with sort of imbalanced setups. I think there is a topic there to be discussed, though, when you talk about list building, and that is kind of the ludology of not even sub games, but of off-board games, which is something I have a lot of complex thoughts about. But yeah, I think that maps into the kind of like coordinate-based understanding of perceived balance as this kind of evolving thing. Right? It shouldn't be completely flat. It should have sort of a rising and falling motion, and even kind of an intertwining motion. I mean, that's one of the really lovely things about Magic the Gathering, right? Is that the board states are roughly accessible, but there's just usually so much, hidden information that they do tend to, create in a lot of the best games these like prolonged states of uncertainty.
Now, I kind of feel like when you just have a conversation with a random player, like, they're not going to necessarily think of balance in that way.
Sure.
And I kind of want to juxtapose like this sort of idea of like the fighting chance with what you're saying, because I feel like most people, when they think of balance, they kind of feel like if you took out player skill, if there was a way to do that in some way, that it would be a coin flip. And I don't necessarily think that's what you're referring to by like obscuring who is going to win.
Well, so I think that what it comes down to is it's not. So I don't think players view a balanced game as a coin flip per se. What it is that imbalance is the thing that we necessarily are sensing, right? That it's the edges of the field that we want to avoid, which is a game where we arrive at the table and we already know the outcome, because then why play? Right? And so in that middle zone, I think you're right that there's a mentality where, in the interest of staying away from those extremes, we believe, yes, I would like a game that is not, that is a coin flip, that is not predetermined. But I think that's an articulation that kind of assumes on the part of the user that they are understanding their desires, which I think intrinsically a lot of people don't. So I agree with you wholeheartedly that a lot of users will come and they'll have this idea of what would make a game more balanced, for example, right? Like, especially you talk about Warhammer 40K, somebody brings the meta list, you say, oh my God, this is so imbalanced. Why? Well, it's because you have a pretty good idea that you're going to lose. And what would make the game more balanced is just that happening less, right? Is to have less of the game in a state where you still have to play it to be polite, but you're fairly certain that you're going to win and it's boring, or you're going to lose and it's boring and bad. So yeah.
So I put together, and we were chatting before the recording went on, but I put together a list of like 5 things I think balance can mean. It's definitely not all inclusive, right? And then there's a degree for each of these items. You can go one way or the other, or right down the middle, and that's all of these, right? When you put them together, are gonna, I think, change that perception of how balanced a game is, or why it's balanced or imbalanced. But from the top, right? So the first one I think is fairness, and it's probably just another word for balance, right? Like, both players want to go to the table feeling like they have a fair chance at being successful or achieving their objective of the game, whether that's beating their opponent or scoring a certain point or what have you, right? It essentially prevents one side from having an inherent advantage over the other side, and promotes a level playing field so that you're fostering healthy competition and enhancing the overall enjoyment that both players can have. And again, you can go both ways on this, right? Where that playing field isn't necessarily a level that's perfectly level. Maybe it's tilted one way or another. And you can have some asymmetric balance there as well. I think that kind of jumps into the next point, which is strategic depth. So this is essentially a type of balance that encourages strategic thinking and decision making. When we were talking about list building earlier, right? That's kind of a strategic mini game prior to models ever hitting the table.
Now,
Which
are
is
you
then
thinking
that kind of
in terms of like one side has more depth, like has more strategic options than the other side, even though maybe they both...
I think, yeah. So this is kind of just saying players have the ability when both sides are evenly matched. Players have the ability to devise effective tactics and adapt their strategies. So adapt those pieces they're bringing to the table to overcome their opponent's strategies. Right? Those you have options, or maybe you feel like you have options to overcome the challenge and win. Right? So what you're doing here is engaging, I think, on multiple levels, and creating a challenging gameplay experience where both players can adapt. They're not locked into one lane, and they need to make thoughtful choices to outmaneuver.
I kind of want to run with this a little bit. Is that okay? And we'll come back to the other three. Because I have a question. So like a different type of balance, I think, than we've been talking about so far is like, if you think about like a wizard versus a fighter in D&D, you're playing a cooperative game where like both sides are going to win, assuming that you're like doing well. But like there is oftentimes discussions about balance between like classes where like a wizard can do way more damage with a lightning bolt than a fighter can do with its 2 attacks. And I think that is, I'm curious about what you all think about that variation on balance, because I think it falls into that world of like strategic depth where like the wizard has all these wild options and then the fighter just has I attack again or whatever.
Well, to your point, I don't know that I think that when you talk about tabletop RPGs, there's always several games in play, right? There's the actual sort of mechanical means, right? And stakes, whatever, reducing monsters' hit points, making specific rolls. And then there's also the social function, right? Of involvement, but also then there is the layer of performance. And so I think that when you talk about the sort of casters versus marshals problem, I think you're right that there's, a perceived imbalance there. And I think that it is on all three of those registers, right? Where people recognize, yes, a caster can outperform me. A caster by necessity, as a result of outperforming me, gains more or has more opportunities for social cachet. And not only that, can more reliably role play competence, right? Because people will like to make characters who are kind of bumbling from time to time. But I think that when you talk about games based on agency, right, based on action, characterization is sort of wrapped up in your ability to turn intention into reality, right? It is in agency. And so I think that's like another register of imbalance that's being sensed, is that no matter what you do at the table, a wizard could probably do it better. So I don't think that's necessarily a factor of complexity, right? It's not that the wizard has chosen to, solve a trigonometric function every time he does anything and is rewarded for his superior galaxy brain strategy of doing this. It's that you picked an option that doesn't do what it looks like it should do, and the wizard's option could do what you do better. And that the thing is that ends up feeling quite a bit like a certainty, because frankly the D&D model of casting produces very little uncertainty. So that's
like negative balance, right? Or imbalance. I think you can do interesting things with it though, right? Like a game I'm working on designing right now has, wizards and warriors and what have you. But those wizards, right, even though they can potentially land a hit that's much more powerful than a warrior, they can do so less frequently or less reliably.
Sure.
Or with that reliability also comes risk, right? They may absolutely take someone's head off, but kind of following that Warhammer Fantasy or 40K model, some form of miscast, right, where they could die or they could take out a bunch of their friends. There's that chance there to make it riskier.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's where it comes into like perception, right? Where actually a great example, because the game I'm working on does something similar, where basically casting spells or using spell-like abilities is dangerous to the point that it's basically not worth using it on something that you could do without using magic. And so what's funny is that whenever I get a new playtest group together, if one of them is using magic, people really quickly say like, wow, this guy can do a lot of stuff. And he'll say, oh, I'm having a great time like doing this. And then he'll look at all of these sort of, negative effects from casting magic that they've accrued. And it's like, suddenly they're realizing that they're kind of up shit creek. So I think that in order for that to sort of be represented as actual balance, people have to perceive those risks, which is a difficulty as a designer. Mm-hmm. And also they have to take those risks seriously, right? The example I like to give is there was someone I was working with on I think it was a module for like Pathfinder or something. And they had this like, I don't know what they're called in Pathfinder. I think they're called archetypes still in Pathfinder, where basically your character could like pay health in order to make their spells better. And it's like, okay, that's neat. The thing is that basically if you have a group that's willing to let people roll up new characters, then someone is just always going to have one of these in the bag and just use it to absolutely body serious challenges and then move on with their life. And that kind of invalidates the game because there's an assumption of investment there that like the cost means something. So I think you're right. Just to sort of come back to the point that, it has to, you can iron out those asymmetries, right? And that's the thing, is asymmetry does not necessarily mean imbalance, but what it ultimately comes down to is the perception of like, is this abuse or use invalidating other people's like agency and play, right? Like if you have a character that you're really, really enjoying playing, that takes a certain type of threat seriously or is invested in a certain type of problem, and you give people the ability to create a throwaway character that just solves that problem, that is, right, in the game of social cachet and of role-playing performance, a perceived imbalance that's kind of intractable. So it's a fraught thing, right? And again, that's not to say it can't be done well, but it really comes out to people receiving it as intended, which is often the most difficult part of design. Well,
yeah, and I think that, I don't know, maybe this is a bit forced, but it kind of segues into the next point, right? Which is third one, I had replayability, right? So how many times can you play this game without losing the excitement of playing, right? And I think with what we were talking about on the previous point, if you're creating throwaway characters or there's an option that repeatedly shows itself as the better option, people are going to shift to that with each playthrough, potentially. And then the game becomes less diverse. You have less options overall if you keep gravitating towards that, quote unquote, better option. And then ultimately, there's fewer unique possibilities or outcomes. less to explore in terms of strategy or experiment. And depending on your play group, this often results in less fun, right? So I guess a different way to say that is if the game is well balanced, each time you play it or each match offers those unique possibilities and outcomes, and players can explore their different strategies. They can experiment with different units, factions, character types, and experience. I mean, another way to do it is diverse scenarios, right? Like Infinity, the game has a whole book full of scenarios, and that increases the replay value. And because there's so many options and so much diversity, it starts to feel more balanced the more you play, because you're still exploring and experiencing something new, and goes back to those previous points where you can potentially win, right?
So it's actually interesting, because it's what I'm kind of sensing here is that, like, so the model that I'm kind of ascribing for balance is on the level of either a game state or a game session. But when you talk about replayability, like, you're sort of conceptualizing balance as a feature of a game that is experienced over multiple sessions, which is actually really interesting. That's not a way I would have thought of to really articulate it. But I do see how that is a kind of register of balance, right? Because there's the immediate sense of balance of play, and then there's the sense of game as an object, right? Whether or not it contains this kind of like weird, platonic essential feature called balance. I will say also, interestingly, what you had mentioned regarding, different scenarios and like viability and abusing strategies, creating a sense of imbalance, actually ties into one of our original topics that we were going to talk about, which was ludonarrative dissonance, which sort of presents an interesting sort of example of how, if narrative play, right, if immersion is a form of engagement, right, where outcomes are uncertain and that's the reason you play, that a game can be imbalanced in such a way that the perception of imbalance is through its poor relationship with those instrumentalities, right? And by that I mean, like, if a game has ludonarrative dissonance, it creates this feeling of being imbalanced, because you're sort of promised this experience and all of a sudden you know what it is. And a great example, just to sort of throw one out, because I know that's like a lot of words, if you ever played the game Darkest Dungeon, the video game Darkest Dungeon, just for in case anyone listening hasn't, or either of you haven't, it's about doing Lovecraftian dungeon crawls that are very like about the injuries to your characters and sort of growing this roster of grizzled veterans. It turns out the most efficient way to play that game is to have a roster of veterans that you feed all of your resources and then just continuously recruit just bumbling idiots, and just go let them die in the dungeon and collect the meager loot that they crawl out with, and then just fire them. Which again, it reduces the replayability of the game, because that is such a crushingly optimal strategy, and it has absolutely no narrative or sort of like ludonarrative reward, right?
I think another example, right, is more people might be familiar with it, just Dungeons and Dragons like adventure modules, right? Mm-hmm. If you think about some of these great adventure modules, you can play them more than once, right? Like, that would make a module great, in my mind anyways, is because you can go back, draft up a new set of characters or whatever, and run the adventure again. If that outcome of the adventure is so narrow that each time you play it through, it's going to be the same experience, and that experience then becomes less fun the more times you play it, because you know all the right moves. Or like you're talking about with Darkest Dungeon, there's that optimal winning strategy that people gravitate towards. It becomes less fun over time, and that replayability dies. And then overall, right, the perception of balance dies. And as game designers or people trying to sell games, people trying to play games even, you want to invest in something that can have some longevity. Yeah. So I think it's essential for that long term, even if it's a one-off game, right? Like, the one-off game needs to feel balanced, but you need to be able to pick it up and play another one-off game.
Sure.
And that also needs to feel balanced.
Yeah, I think that's an element. To be clear, I think it's sort of a lateral element of balance, type of balance that games can embody, but not. I would say that it's sort of sufficient, but perhaps not always necessary, right? Like there are plenty of games that might give you an incredible sort of narrative experience that just you can never experience it first the same twice in a row, right? It's about sort of the shock and the novelty, which I think is a type of value. But
well, and that again kind of steps into the next part, which we've been talking about through this whole piece, which is player satisfaction.
Yeah.
Right. So ultimately, balance is going to contribute to satisfaction of your player base by ensuring that victory or defeat is earned through, and the example I gave is through skill or competence rather than arbitrary factors, right? But sometimes arbitrary factors help keep some of that balance, right? Like random dice rolls or card pulls, hidden information, random hidden information, right? That can all lead to some of that balance, as long as it's creating a satisfying experience and rewarding players with a gratifying experience.
Yeah, I think it's...
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was just sort of covering something that you said earlier, which was like that players typically have not investigated like their desires. And I think that's really interesting because that is my experience as well, where I think it's pretty rare for a player to say, like, I like this sort of experience at the table, or I like to feel these emotions at the table, or even I like to do these certain types of puzzles. I think oftentimes players show up to a table really having investigated that very little. And so I completely agree that it's player satisfaction is such a big part of balance, but at the same time, it's such an interesting problem because very rarely do players come to the table with discrete expectations or discrete desires. Besides maybe winning, like the joy of ordering yourself among other people. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it kind of goes back on the last point too, which is replayability, right? Like, I'll use Infinity the game as an example again, for those of you who haven't heard of it or played it, right? It's a, like, let's say sci-fi skirmish game, right? You got roughly 10 models on each side, and you're trying to achieve sometimes asymmetrical objectives. There's a really, really cool army builder for Infinity the game online, where you can go through and select your different units that you add to your list, and there's just a huge number, similar to 40K or fantasy, right? There's a huge number of options that you have to select from to make a 10-man list, 10-woman list, right? When I'm playing a game and my friend groups are playing a game, right, we're never going to be able to explore everything we want to in terms of a list or a thematic list, a competitive list, etc. The first time we play that game, we're going to want to come back and try something new the next time, or try to improve what we brought in the previous game, right, and iterate off of that list. And I think that's one of the things you're getting at, right? Like, you're not necessarily going to come to the table the first time you play a game with an idea of what you want. You're going to maybe learn that the more you play the game, and you're going to learn what you enjoy and what you don't enjoy, and kind of try to work towards that.
Well, I do think that's a big part of where theming comes into play, right? Yeah. Because you're right that a lot of players don't come to the table knowing what they want in a granular way. They're not going to say like, oh, I want this probability of winning. I want, this kind of ludological topology or some sort of nonsense.
Yeah.
No, but the thing is that when you have a theme, you're making a promise, right? You pick up, I can't speak to newer 40K because I don't play it anymore, but you pick up old Warhammer 40K book. It's got, guys with big skull helmets shooting at aliens, and it's, kind of rad, right? It looks like some kind of sci-fi power metal album cover. And so there's implicitly, if people are engaging with your game, it's because they're engaging with the theming of it. Obviously, there are games that are less sort of thematic, lower concept games, right? That are totally abstract. And there, the promise is a little more logical, right? It's like, okay, you're someone who likes games that are abstract and difficult and puzzles, like games like Azul, or even games I don't particularly like Brass, where the theming exists but is not terribly important. But for the majority of games, right, it's an abstraction of some type of thing that you might think is cool. And to the point about player satisfaction, I think a big way to potentially offset situational issues with balance that I've seen in a lot of games that I've been like thinking about in a lot of my designs as well is to make losing fun. And that goes back to theming. Like, honestly, for my money, the most successful game from a perceived balance perspective in the mini wargaming space right now is Turnip 28. I don't know if either of you have played it, but one of the lovely things about it is that winning is fun because you get to win. Losing is also fun because your guys will eat each other or blunder headfirst into some kind of swamp volcano. Like, if you can't be good, you will at least be able to be funny. And the expectation of that is just absolutely baked into the system.
Yeah.
So that's not for everyone. I know that some people prefer a little more serious of an experience, but I do think that kind of an element where you find a way to take to get technical, right, a sort of downward trend in your probability of winning and still associate that with an increase in game satisfaction, I think is a way to kind of smooth over, issues with balance. There's actually another element that I'd like to hear how you guys think about this. So one of the sort of critical factors in game balance as sort of perceived balance, right, is that you have to find a mechanism to end your game appropriately, right? Because it's inevitable that at a certain point, you're going to find out who's going to win. Absent some kind of like judging or, like we've discussed earlier, end game scoring, at a certain point, you'll be able to like see the writing on the wall. And I think what's really interesting is that a lot of games, the way that they will handle this is basically by making their games very short. Right. That I think has been a theme in skirmish games for a while now. And I would say it's not just because older skirmish games can last a while. I do think it's an attempt to improve perceived balance because basically by, turn 4, by turn 5, whatever it turns out to be, you can usually tell who's going to come out ahead, and so the game just kind of ends. I think 40K has been doing that for 3 or 4 editions now, when it didn't used to be that way. And a lot of games are copying them in that respect.
Yeah, you look at it's blanking now. War Machine or Hordes, right?
Yeah.
Or again, Infinity. That one keeps coming up, but I think I could be wrong, but I think a lot of those games are locked to 3 turns.
Yeah.
Right. Like, end at turn 3, game is over, and you're maybe scoring points during the game or at the end of the game, as we've been chatting through. But I think ultimately what that can do in a lot of games, especially like a war game where you have, we'll call them resources, right? Whether that's your models or your action points or both or what have you, right? When you limit the number of turns you have, one of the things you're doing is limiting your ability to remove those resources that your opponent has. So on that last turn, ideally, you would still have enough resources for call it a last ditch effort. And I think we were talking about it earlier, right? Like, there's that kind of perceived ability, like I can still win.
Yeah,
right? I have enough to still have a chance. And that creates kind of a competitiveness, but a fun competitiveness where both players are still in it till the end. It is a little arbitrary sometimes, right? Where you're just, okay, I definitely have the upper hand, but you snuck in right at the end there on that time limit. and you're completely surrounded, but somehow you've won. And that goes back into the player satisfaction, right? Like you have to balance that fun for the players, right? And making sense, which goes back to the ludonarrative dissonance, right? Does it make sense to win in this way? And is it fun to win in this way? And then is it balanced to allow players to win in this way?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think. Well, my mind first, when discussing like using the ending as a way to sort of obscure if you're going to win or lose, my mind first went to role-playing games where there's this like perception that in a lot of them that they'll go on forever, and that they usually fizzle out with this. Although not usually, they will sometimes fizzle out because of that perceived imbalance, like either the imbalance of between the characters, or the imbalance that just like the characters are too powerful, nothing will ever destroy them. But like there is this sort of like promise of an infinite game, and I completely agree that like shortening the games does give a tool for like making it more difficult to calculate who would win. Yeah, I think that's super interesting.
Yeah. Well, and necessarily it means that the space is also a little clearer, right? There's the number of moves, the range on a given unit is a little more fixed in that respect. So it does bring the complexity down. Personally, I find that kind of design mildly abhorrent. My biggest point of comparison is always between Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh. I've mentioned Magic a couple times. I'm not a huge fan of like where Magic is at like right this second, and haven't played like competitively in like a decade. Yeah. Probably more now, actually. God, it might have been 15 years since I've done anything competitive in Magic. But Yu-Gi-Oh has just the weirdest meta I've ever seen, where games rarely last more than 3 player turns. And that's not 3 back and forth. That's my turn, your turn, my turn. Wow. Yeah, which is I think that the game clearly has a balance problem in that respect, right? Because very quickly it's, who wins is just sort of a resolution. But I think that is, resolved in kind of a slot machine fashion where, it only takes 5 minutes to play a game or whatever. And so you can just get on with your life. So yeah, I think that's, it's just interesting how that is kind of it's a social solution, right? In the same way that like, algorithms are a social solution to the attention problem. Yeah. But is it necessarily the most holistic solution? I don't think so. But for anyone out there in game design land, if your game is frustrating to play and perceived as imbalanced, limit it to an absurdly small number of turns. Who knows? Maybe that'll be the secret sauce.
I think that
social aspect is. Go ahead.
I think I was gonna. Community was one of your points on your model, and yep. I think it's interesting to think of. Have you ever experienced this, like when you're playing like 40K or really like Magic Commander or something, where the general like culture around the game is that you don't bring the most broken thing, well, you're sort of like beer and pretzels style of play, where the balance is not coming from the game because the game is actually poorly written and imbalanced, or the game balance in the case of Commander is off because some cards cost $1,000. And so the community like kind of throttles what's possible in the game just sort of through shame almost. I don't know if that's where you're going with community as part of your model, but I think that's like
it's interesting phenomenon. Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's an interesting aspect, and I think absolutely related to balance. I was going towards community, so good call. The cost to win, like dollar value to win, is an interesting one, right? Because we've been talking about Magic in some, I will say, versions or iterations of that card game, right? It's whoever paid the most usually has a better chance of winning, right? Yeah. All other things being equal, which is a really, really interesting aspect to balance, and I think can exist outside of game design. You see with miniature games as well, right? Like where a company will release a new model or several models and new rules for them, and people refer to it as power creep, where those things being released are typically more powerful than the older iterations, and so people scramble to buy them and play with them so that they can kind of be on top of that meta. And then you're absolutely right. Like I've been in game stores where people will show up to a community game event or game night or whatever, and they say, "Oh, I'm bringing this army." They set it on the table, and there's those guys who will refuse to play them because they're like, "Oh, that's the broken army. I'm not playing that," right? Which that's not fun. You don't ever want to be that guy that's invested all that money and then no one will play with you. Yeah. So it's an interesting challenge.
Well, and what's further complicates that is that it doesn't necessarily have to be true, right? Going back to perceived balance. Yeah. Like, do either of you play Gaslands? I think Trey, you mentioned Gaslands.
I have looked at the book, but I have not gotten it to the table, no.
So in Gaslands, there's a sponsor you can play, which is sort of like a faction called Beverly the Devil on the Highway, who I won't get into the specifics, but it's like if one player is playing checkers and the other one is playing like backgammon. It fundamentally changes the way you play the game. Like you have all these ghost cars that can like get soul points and resurrect one of your cars, and like there's all this stuff. So there's a perception that Beverly is quite imbalanced. When what's really going on is that nobody but Beverly players understand Bev rules. And so throughout the whole game, you have no idea whether the moves you're making are productive or not. I mean, you can make moves that seem productive, but whether or the extent to which they are is super unclear because the rules are just so radically different. And so there is this perception that Bev is super, super imbalanced, when in fact it's just fine. I mean, there are lists you can play against it. There are, you just have to kind of figure out what your particular racing team's response needs to be to a Bev list. But crucially, it's really not as imbalanced as some other things that people are fairly ready to accept. So, and it's interesting. That is what, Garfield's model in characteristics of games refers to as an agential feature, which is a game a game feature that is produced by the users playing it. And so that tends to make up, things that seem like externalities, like social esteem and things like that, which are, in truth, like the reason you play the game, right? Like a great example is like nobody would play World of Warcraft if you knew that it was in kind of a bottle universe, right? That all the players running around were just NPCs and this was your own private instance. I mean, someone might, like if you're on a desert island, you'd probably boot that up a few times, but the attraction, is not the complex and intricate gameplay necessary, to get first mastery on a skill on your server. It's that you did a thing before anyone else did, right? It's not just having a little merit badge that says I'm in the most successful raid guild. It's actually doing it when no one else did. And I think, kind of the inverse of that is doing things that no one else thinks you should do, which is where you get into, playing these kind of black sheep factions or lists or options. And so basically what ends up happening is that the agential feature of the game removes things. It just says, don't play this, right? Don't take this option either because it's too good, or sometimes it's just don't play it because it's awful, right? A great example is in the early days of Diablo 2, right? nobody talked about playing Amazon because it's just like Amazon sucks. Like it wasn't even part of the conversation. There are some PvP builds, it turns out, that are quite good, but that's, a whole nother conversation. But agentially, it had been ruled out. And so if someone was playing in Amazon, it was considered impolite. Like it was like a joke. It's like, why are you doing this? It was effectively the same as like showing up to your friend's house nude. And so, yeah, I definitely think that's something that balance influences, right? Is what choices people view as, socially taboo or socially acceptable.
But it's also making those choices, I think, readily available and understandable, right? So like your Gaslands example, and I think this holds true for a lot of games. When something new comes out, or maybe it's not new, but it's wildly different than your other options, your average, I think, player base is usually only going to have the time and willingness to seek out and understand what it is they're playing with, right? So they're going to understand maybe their faction or their pieces in their faction. And then those players who are really into it might understand another couple factions, or in some cases, right, they try to get a good grasp on a lot of those other factions available. The truly, like when we're talking from a competitive and winnings perspective, truly great players are those ones who could pick up anything and play it at a very high level because they understand how it works and those mechanics that make the strategies that faction has available to it competitive. And so when you have things that are wildly different from each other and more options that are wildly different from each other, that creates some, I think, inherent imbalance, because not all your players are going to seek to understand those differences, and they may be introduced to some kind of rock, paper, scissors type feelings. I'm never going to be able to beat that with what I have because I haven't adapted my strategy and understood what it's bringing to the table.
Yeah, I think there's that information disparity aspect in a lot of games. I think, like, to me, an example that comes to mind is like Magic, where like you've played a bunch of games against like in your local scene, and you get a sense of like what's possible in the decks, and then somebody could come with something out of nowhere and where you don't have a sense of like what's in their hand. And I think
right.
that's an interesting feature. And I think one thing that I saw happening with my very brief time paying attention to the 40K tournament scene was that you would have this situation where a new book would come out. A certain group of the player base was able to buy all the things that could exploit like the weird rules interactions before the FAQ came out, and that those people would have an understanding of what's possible in their army and also have the financial capacity to exploit the problems. And then they'd show up to a tournament and win a bunch of games just based off of that, both the information disparity and the sort of monetary disparity between players, which I think both are kind of like play into that social feature of balance.
So it's actually interesting that you guys talk about the the nature of sort of being able to perceive the whole of a game at once, right? Yeah. As being this, it is an element of a game's replayability independent of balance, as well as sort of involved in it because it comes down to people's perceived likelihood of winning. This is actually somewhere where I think we're gonna have a little more of a discussion, because I actually want to go back to discussions about whether or not complexity creates higher perceived balance, because actually I would argue that at a certain point it actually inverts itself. So there's this notion of sort of climbing the tree of hierarchies within a game to understand the heuristics at a higher and higher level, right? The thing is that's a very rewarding process. People sort of naturally like to understand things better because it gives them a greater sense of agency. However, when you play against another player, their position on that heuristic tree is not accessible to you. And so that can represent a state where players lower on the heuristic tree through no fault of their own, maybe they're just new to the game, consistently losing produces the sensation that the game isn't balanced, right? You as a chess player walk into, just learning the basics of the game, walk into a chess tournament and lose every game. For a lot of people, not correctly, but again, it's about perception. That might come away with the perception the game is quite imbalanced, because then the sensation is the same. It's the assumption that whenever they step up to the table, they'll lose. And so I do think that at a certain point, if your heuristics reach a point where players cannot access them as part of the losing process, right? If they cannot identify the point at which they actually made a tactical error, then you run the risk of locking people out of the meta.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's where like formats and, basically constructing different games that are checkpointed at points along the heuristic hierarchy are important. But I do think that there are a lot of games that do go too hard in the paint in that respect, right? Like tabletop RPGs in particular. I think that the sort of culture around, whatever they call it, like theory crafting or whatever, where people like produce these utterly broken builds, I think that is like inherently toxic to the kind of instrumentality of tabletop RPGs with respect to like, role play and performance and the social modalities of the game. Are there other outlets for that? Absolutely. So just to give you a radical example, one of the tabletop role-playing games I'm working on right now, one of my goals was to have a fairly low heuristic ceiling, right? Where there are some, strategies that you can get in mind that are accessible and pretty clear, right? That you can leverage, that the selection you have is fairly limited, and that produces replay value because basically you can only take so many options. But then on top of that, basically I filled the book, the margins, the art, everything with 3 different types of ciphered text. So if somebody wants to climb the heuristic tree, there is a puzzle embedded in the book that in fact has lateral game options built into it.
That's funny. I like that.
Like there are non-critical character options that you can discover through ciphered text. And so if somebody wants to chew on that book for hours a day, they absolutely can.
Yeah, that's I love the idea of like deliberately hiding information about the game inside of the rule book. That's, I think, very clever. I kind of want to return to like the chess example, because in terms of perceived balance, when you sit down in a chess tournament, I think there actually is like a ranking system. Like you have grandmasters and stuff. So if like I were to sit down at a table with a grandmaster, my perceived opportunity to win the game would be very low. And that's like that's part of like the community aspect of balance that like.
Sure. I mean, this wasn't a directed attack at chess. It was just
no. I was just
a generic example. I mean,
I was just using it as
in specific, you see it all the time in Warhammer, right? Like I live right down the street from a Games Workshop, and my entire time growing up was punctuated by new guy shows up, thinks he understands Warhammer, gets his ass kicked for 6 months straight, and then quits.
Yeah, but I think that's that's still like you can still have like a perceived imbalance at the table in that instance too. I'm not trying to like counter your example. I'm just trying to kind of tie it into the idea of community as like a way of like where you can have imbalance that exists actually outside of the game itself, which I think is kind of what you're pointing towards, where like I think like while I may have the same ability to like according to the rules, like I have access to all the same rules as somebody who wins every other 40K tournament. If I sat down at a table to play one of those people, my perceived opportunity to win would be very low. And because there's like, I think that there's another, like a social balance, another style of social balance that happens where like you wouldn't arrange a game where I would play a grandmaster unless the grandmaster was like deliberately teaching me how to play or something.
Yeah.
I think like that's another avenue for balance to happen where where I as a player like am sort of responsible for being honest about where I am with my understanding of the game and not go into an environment where I'm just going to get crushed.
Well, I think it's just that you have to be clear about the extent of the hierarchies.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that that's something that is difficult to discover because you're right. I'm not saying like everyone is entitled to win all the time. Obviously not. Right. But there are a lot of games where the apparent depth of heuristic hierarchy is way different than the actual in either direction.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that especially when we talk about tabletop war games, right, which I think is an area of interest for all of us.
Yeah.
I think that the Ludo narrative of the game is an intrinsically sort of nearly fair contest, right? When you have a game with a point system, there's kind of an assumption that if you take two armies of equal points where one of them isn't just like all of the points spent on, joke units or something, right? You can always deliberately break these things, but that generically the points are there to produce balance. And so they should produce balance, but quite often they don't. And that comes down to that heuristic complexity.
Yeah, I think ultimately kind of wrapping up the community piece, at least from how I was thinking about it, right? The last piece, right, around two players coming together with equal, say, points values of a force and playing a game, and feeling like they should be competitive, right? If you've designed a game, let's say agnostic of a community, let's say the community doesn't necessarily exist yet. It's two players sitting down playing a 100-point game against each other, right? They both feel like they can win. They both feel like they have a competitive chance. And kind of, the last 4 points hold true where there's satisfaction in playing that game against each other. They could replay that 100-point game multiple times with potential different outcomes and still be satisfied. They feel like they have that depth of choice. And it's overall, right, from a design perspective, it feels fair. I think if you have that, it will naturally create a sense of community because you will have more people who can get together and say, let's play a 100-point game or a 500-point game or a 5,000-point game, whatever it is, right? You can communicate with that community saying, I'm going to be, time and place. I'm going to be at the store with this many points. Let's play. You don't necessarily need to know all of those details around what your opponent is bringing and has and preparing. And that's part of the fun of it, right? It creates the ability to foster a strong community and promote that competitive play. When you're promoting competitive play, whether it's competitive can be a lot of things, right? It's not necessarily tournament for money. Maybe it's a competitive and engaging narrative event, right? Where you have a lot of players showing up, bringing things that are inherently balanced to those other players that are showing up, right? When the game is fair and balanced, it attracts more players. It encourages things like tournaments or events. And then that's like all that is facilitating enthusiastic players, an enthusiastic community. And those opportunities that creates are really creating opportunities for people, for humans to connect, share strategies, and compete on a broader scale. So like we've talked a lot about, someone putting a list down on the table that socially people might say, oh, that's broken. I don't want to play against it, right? But to get to that point, you've likely gotten to the point where you have a community that's able to talk amongst itself and kind of rope people into the game and build that social network.
Let's swap.